Thank you, and welcome again to everybody. You are the brave ones. You made it up till now. You will also make it up to the drinks. We will make sure of that. So I'm very excited for having this final panel now. We have a wonderful panel, which I will present in 1 second. I would just like to tell you, we will have at first some remarks and then some questions for the panel. And then if there is interest, we obviously would also like to have questions from you, and then we can go seamlessly over to the drinks. Okay, so our panelists are today, and I'm very glad to have all of you here. So we have Carlos Alvarado Quesada, the former president of the Republic of Costa Rica, and now the climate mobility envoy of the UN Global Center for Climate Mobility. Welcome, Carlos. We have James Aparitai, the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges from NATO. Welcome, James. And I'm glad to welcome Segal Abshir, Environment Security Unit Head at UNEP in Kenya. And finally, Cosme Dobran, Director at the EEAS Peace Partnerships and Crisis Management Directorate. So I would like to start with inviting Carlos to give us some initial remarks. Please.
Thank you very much, Marcos, and thanks to the esteemed panelists also for being here, and to the honored guests. On behalf of the Global Center for Climate Mobility, I would like to thank you for inviting us to be part of this important conference, and also thank the German government for being a vital partner in our efforts in Africa, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and in the Pacific. We are extremely grateful for that support. I'd like to share 4 ideas with you, and I'll try to keep it to the time Marcos and I discussed, less than 2 hours. No, but I'll discuss 4 concepts, and one has to do with security, multilateralism, migration, and knowledge, data knowledge. And I'll try to make brief points in any one. Making emphasis on the concepts themselves. Being from Costa Rica, I was raised in a country without an army. So my conception of security is a conception that's pretty much linked with security as education, security as healthcare, and most recently, security to tackle threats as drug trafficking, for example. And that pretty much set my concept, my approach, even my emotions to the topic of security. But then I started to realize that that was a singular view from my own background. I then started to understand that for other views, when we talk about security, we are talking about national defense, national sovereignty, deterrence, military, and concept of the sort, which, under the same umbrella of a concept, vary in not only in what they portray, but how we act confronted with the topic. Let me give you another example. What does sovereignty and statehood in that conception of security means nowadays for a country in the Pacific Islands, let's say Tuvalu? What is security in that regard? Also a country without an army. And in face and confronted, because of climate change, the other concept that has us, or phenomena that has us here, that influenced the whole conception of what is preserving their livelihood, what they love, their citizenships, their sovereignty. So my first point in the concept of security is to question ourselves under what concept are we having that conversation. But furthermore, climate change in the current context challenges us to stretch our notions, also to expand which kind of response we're given to phenomena. And also because if we remain within the concept that many of us are taught, we might not be giving the appropriate answer. We need to stretch the limit of what we had been taught. Traditionally, those concepts are. Similarly, to the second concept or idea I want to share, multilateralism. Whether we are in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Germany or in the UN, we speak very naturally about multilateralism. When I'm with friends and family sometimes, and they ask me, what is it that I'm doing now? And I say, well, I'm working in the multilaterals. And they said, what? Because multilateralism, it's not a concept necessarily clear for most of populations. Even it is so embedded and clear for us. And actually that's, isn't it, Marcus, the topic of this panel. So what is it I say when I try to explain what is multilateralism? Well, I try to say it's an international rule-based system to try to preserve peace and protect us all. A system based on rules and not merely on power. So people say, oh, why didn't you say that? So if we remember that, we also conceive that at the origin of this concept there is a goal, which I believe is pretty actual, has not changed that much. But the challenges today show that that multilateral system or that system is fragmented, is weakened, and that is threatening all of us, our security. Is threatening our response also to climate change because it's fragmented. That is why it's so critical, not only for a conceptual point of view or an ethical point of view, but because on a practical, existential point of view, that we need to strengthen multilateralism in many regards. We need to strengthen it, as it was mentioned today, in the financial institutions. They still play that role as a principle to what they were created, but they do not necessarily are designed out for the challenges of today. But we need not to scrap the goal, but to strengthen it, to address the challenges of today. We see it as the work we're doing in the Global Center for Climate Mobility in the Pacific Islands, how to have a Pacific Islands community climate fund to quickly respond, like in cases of peacekeeping, to rapidly respond to the needs of those countries. You're not needing a huge loan, but you need an agility to change and build trust as well. That's another example. And I question myself also, within those concepts, how come if our biggest existential threat in terms of livelihood, security, it's been climate change, how come we're investing more in nuclear weapons? Does it make sense? Doesn't make sense at all. But then, we need to challenge our conceptions and act accordingly. My third concept is migration. Similar. What is it we think when we say migration? Many think, depending on their background, their role, or their silo, many might think displacement. Others think security threat. Others might think adaptation journey. Yes, it's true, the first response should be the right to stay, but there are places which that is not already a possibility. the adaptation journey. Also, we don't often think migration and solution to many things, win-win scenarios, when we need people to have sustainable livelihoods and where we need, for example, labor force, where there is absence of it, or sustainability of pension systems or others. But when we think migration, it varies. Again, current situation of climate change and climate crisis mostly presses us to stretch the boundary or to redefine the concept, but most of it to redefine it in order to redefine our action. Question our concepts. Never take for granted the concept just this because what's traditionally taught on the university or on the faculty or on the newspaper. What's their origin? And we might find that the action might change. Perhaps that's what we need to do in the intersection of the debate between, or the dialogue between climate crisis and security, and also another phenomenon like migration. And that brings me to the fourth point. Knowledge. You can do it knowledge / working with data, working with science, creating knowledge. And in the Global Center for Climate Mobility, our approach has been to use this knowledge to anticipate. Because we know that climate change is going to bring consequences. We need to anticipate those responses. Therefore, we need to plan. But in this case, in climate change, differently from the classical tradition view of security, which has the concept of borders embedded in this notion, climate change, by definition, has no borders. And the response then, therefore, shouldn't have borders in many cases. This anticipation and this plan requires the multilateral system to act in diverse dimensions. And also, if we manage, and that's my view, to get across the importance in terms of that security, we will have a strong joint action like the one that Tuvalu requires, like the one that the Caribbean requires, the Pacific Islands, that Africa requires, and the whole world. Knowledge then, and the alignment of a conception not only of security broadly speaking, but the alignment of that conception with the conception and the notion of multilateralism should align into action. And I believe those are the paths that could help us sort the situation in which we are. And again, thanks for the invitation. I'm more than happy to share some other thoughts.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for challenging us to question our definitions or question our concepts. Let me give you a short follow-up question. You know, as a president of Costa Rica, you initiated several successful multilateral initiatives, such as fast and affordable access to health services during the pandemic, and also an ambitious coalition for nature and people adopted at the last biodiversity COP. And now you, in your current role, you're representing, as you also elaborated right now, Pacific Islands Rising Nation Initiative. So drawing on your rich and extensive experience, can you share some practical advice with us? What makes a successful initiative in the face of pressing crises? You know, especially, obviously, with regard to our topic today, climate, peace, security challenge. So what's your advice? How do we do this best?
Well, what my advice will be? My advice will be, in the three you mentioned, is that whenever somebody say something it's impossible, that it's a gift, and they are telling you you're on the right track. When we were in the pandemic and we launched with Dr. Tedros the CTAP, the voluntary and free repository of technology to address COVID, most people said it's impossible, nobody's going to deposit any technology there. It's been a couple of years from now, more than 50 countries are part of it, and both governments and private sector have put critical technology in open to access and to develop in many places. So it is possible to make change there. Similar with the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. When we started on 2019, during that pre-COP, to develop that group, we said we want to protect 30% of the ocean and on the land in order to preserve the planet. We need that, actually, to our ecosystems to work to sustain life. Again, people said it was impossible. But in 2022 in Montreal, more than 190 countries committed to the 30 by 30 goal, 5 years after. We went from impossible to 5 countries, to 100 countries, to a multilateral commitment on it that's going to be critical to sustain life. So in the case of initiatives like Rising Nations, to protect the statehood and the sovereignty of countries in the Pacific Islands that in the next decade might not have a territory to live in because of the rise of the level of the sea. We do believe it's possible also to challenge the concept that there's not such a thing as a possibility, and to come up with possibility and to provide people the agency as well, then work to have the agency to address it. So receive always the word impossible as a gift and as fuel for action.
Thank you. Let me go over to you, James. I think you might have had some ideas on your definition of security listening to Carlos, but let me ask you, NATO is actually positioning itself to become, and I quote, the leading international organization when it comes to understanding and adaptation to the impacts of climate change on security. I had to read this, sorry. Germany, in our own national security strategy, we also had a very broad understanding of security, relying on robustness, resilience, and sustainability. So how does NATO put the new dimension of security into praxis? How do we strengthen NATO's role in fighting the climate crisis? And what exactly should the political and military structures do to take up that role?
Just those little questions, yeah.
Thanks shortly before the evening.
So first, thanks for the invitation to be here. Respect to all of you on a Friday afternoon for still being with us. And I listened with great interest. Indeed, I think the NATO definition of security does include military forces. It's sort of what we do. But I think I would answer that question by saying there's sort of good news and bad news. So the good news is NATO gets it. We get that the security implications of climate change are primordial. They are extremely substantial. They are growing quickly and in some cases exponentially. They will have a profound effect on allies, and allies have something to say about contributing to mitigating their effects. And that's embedded in all of our documents, but we actually mean it. And we're doing a few things about it. One is, as you rightly mentioned, the analysis. So we're publishing annual analyses. You can find them on the website. They'll get better and better. And they're focused on the security implications of climate change. We're not the United Nations. We have a specific focus, but we're bringing more and more power into those analyses. And I don't need to run through with you what those are. You all know them. Second, and you mentioned exactly adaptation. And this is where I personally, and I think we're all leaning in very heavily. Climate change is happening. It's happening fast, and it's big. So we have to adapt. We cannot wish this away. So what does that mean? It means we have to adapt our armed forces because they are going to be operating in much hotter places, for example. So Iraq will, in 20 years, and we have deployed forces there now, have over 70 days a year where it's over 50 degrees. And that's just going to keep rising. Our naval bases are going to be under a lot of water pressure. Our training facilities are going to be hot and dry. Our ships won't operate in very hot water, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a huge adaptation for equipment, for personnel, but also when it comes to looking to the future. So we have all sorts of models to look to the future for what will happen. Third is mitigation, as we call it, which is cutting greenhouse gas emissions for the NATO enterprise. So we have a methodology now. We've had it stress tested with an expert outside party. We changed it as a result of that, because what we came up with wasn't that great, but it's good now. We shared it with the allies, and we are heading towards net zero by 2050. That's our target for the entire NATO enterprise. Fourth is partnerships. We are working with all sorts of other organizations, expert organizations, EU, for example, I think primarily, but also with partner countries. So we're trying to work, for example, with countries from North Africa, they're NATO partners, to say, okay, you know a lot about how to deal with this. Maybe we have something to offer too, and maybe we can train and exercise it together. We're developing capabilities. So we have a whole innovation ecosystem, from startups to big defense primes to expert scientists that look downfield. All of them have been given the mission, as part of what they do, to try to develop innovative technologies, including commercial off-the-shelf technologies that can contribute to minimizing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting. And we're taking a comprehensive look at the energy transition going on in all of our countries. There is an energy transition happening everywhere, and I'll turn back to it very quickly at the end. But just to say, let's guide it in the right direction. So right now we're trying to map it out, and then we're going to try to put some guidelines in for allies to look at. So that's the good news. Then there's the bad news, and then I'll come back to energy transition. The bad news is Russia's non-stop war on Ukraine is a catastrophe for climate goals, and it is blowing everything off track. And that is in a number of ways. One is the simple environmental damage. The flaring of Russian gas off its facilities is equal to all the reductions taking place in the EU completely. So everything we're trying to do here is being completely negated by just that one aspect of what Russia is doing. Second, it means we have to buy, all the countries in NATO and many more, have to buy billions of euros worth of new military equipment with existing technology, push it forward, exercise it more, because we have a dramatically worsened security environment. So that's happening as a result of this. Third, because it's made it very difficult for political leaders to lift their eyes from the immediate requirements of today and tomorrow to try to look at the wider issues like climate, which aren't immediately today, tomorrow, but which actually do require political attention, and there's no bandwidth for it because of that. Fourth, because, and Mr. President, you mentioned that, solutions require multilateralism, but we are in an environment where getting Russia, China, and the West to agree and stick to these kind of targets is very difficult, and I saw that Russia just yesterday blocked agreement on declaring an end to fossil fuel use in the run-up to COP. They just don't want it, and so multilateralism is suffering now because of the environment that we're in. So that's the not so good news. What I wanted to conclude with on energy transition is just to say that this energy transition that is happening in NATO countries is happening in large part because of getting off Russian oil and gas, and an understanding that we need to invest in sustainable energy, which is, in general, climate friendly. So there's an opportunity in the crisis. This transition is happening so much faster than it would have happened without this Russian attack on Ukraine, that we see this as an opportunity to really guide and invest in the energy transition so that we end up in a place where we are more secure, more autonomous, but also much more able to contribute to the kind of reductions of CO2 that we would have had to take 20 years to get to without this very unfortunate development. But the best, just to conclude, the best contribution to addressing the security implications of climate change right now is for Russia to stop attacking Ukraine.
Thank you, James, for some sober but also some optimistic words. Let's go over to Sagal. You, as a head of environment security at UNEP, you work extensively with partners in another crisis region, in the Horn of Africa, and we all know this is a region also multi-layered with climate risk. So also an easy question for you as well. What instruments do fragile communities and especially marginalized groups rely on to become climate resilient and safe?
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you to the conference for having me, and really pleased to be on this stage with such an amazing panel. Yeah, another easy question there. So the Horn of Africa, you're absolutely right, and I think that we've heard so much about it over the course of today from different people. Is a region that is struggling with climate issues. We all know there's been a terrible drought over the last few years, followed by floods, not to mention traditional security issues. In fact, all the security issues in the way that it was defined by Carlos, this region is struggling with food insecurity and physical insecurity. So what I wanted to talk about today, it's also a region that is, I'd say, innovating in the area of climate security. It's a region that accepts and is very conscious of the interlinkages. And despite the challenges, you know, on the political side and the security side, is actually taking some really interesting steps on this particular issue. And since, you know, as I was preparing my thoughts today, I know we've heard already about some of the projects that are being implemented. We've heard a lot about the tools, like the early warning tools that are being used. And obviously we've heard a lot about the importance of collaboration and coordination. So I was thinking, you know, how do I talk about multilateralism and effective multilateral action in this region? I thought I'd talk about it in the context of sort of the choreography of effective multilateral action. And I thought I'd talk about it in sort of three ways. The first is really the balance of the technical and the political when it comes to this work. And the example that I would give there, of course, as UNEP, you know, our mandate in the UN system is to obviously monitor and advocate for the environment and to help governments with manage, essentially protect and manage their ecosystems, including some of their sort of transboundary issues. And the way we do that is through essentially technical scientific inputs into, you know, these various political processes. And we do that in the Horn specifically through an initiative, again, that you mentioned this morning, the Climate Security Mechanism, where we're providing climate and peace security advisors into the UN political missions. And there's the Office of the Special Envoy of the Horn in Addis that has our advisor, Liz, who's sitting over there. And essentially the role there is to provide some of this impartial, you know, high quality technical inputs into the political work of that office, which is to coordinate the UN, again, from a multilateral perspective, behind a comprehensive prevention strategy, which has as one of its pillars climate, peace, and security. And more importantly, also, it's to support the activities of the region. Again, a region that's very aware of these interlinkages. And there's been some amazing work over the last year, let's say, on developing different policies, but most importantly, the climate security coordination mechanism, again, something that you'd heard about today. So the sort of constant interlude between the technical work supporting the political, but the political, again, providing space for some of this technical work to happen. The second axis is the importance of working on sort of the local level and, of course, the high level and regional levels, let's say. And I think in conflict settings, and especially in the Horn, sometimes local actions can be possible even when some of the higher level ones can't be. And of course, in the inverse, some high-level sort of political interventions can unlock space for some of the community actions, again, to support the activities of various communities. And I think in this region, we have a situation, again, where we're working at the regional level, but again, we have an advisor like Chris, who's supporting, for example, Somalia, and you've got Johnson working in South Sudan. So there's the opportunity to work at the local level, you know, waiting again for that opening to move back and forth. And then thirdly, the issue of pacing. And so you've got the slow and steady work of sort of consultation, being participatory, bringing countries in, engaging communities and securing buy-in. And on the other hand, you've got sort of, when the right things are lined up, the speed and the sort of decisive action that's necessary when things are lined up. And I'd say in the Horn, again, we do have a situation where we have the analysis, we have the evidence base, we've got this highest level political buy-in at heads of state level, again, for this mechanism that we're talking about. And really everything's ready to go. And I think the thing that we need to make sure is there really is the resources, which I think, again, was a challenge that was raised in the first panel today about the challenge of getting resources to some of these fragile and conflict-affected states. So I'll stop there for now.
The call for resources is well heard. Thank you, and let me go over to Cosmin. Cosmin, the European Commission and the High Representative have recently presented their joint communication addressing the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on peace, security and defense. So what are the next steps the EEAS will take to implement the joint communication?
Thank you very much, Marcus, and good afternoon to all of you. Let me start by thanking the organizers for this event, for having me. It's your 5th edition, but it's my first. And I must confess that I learned a lot from the presentations today. This is quite an accelerated learning curve for me. Second, to say that I think it's quite good that you have the discussion between organizations like the ones we represent at the end and at the beginning, the grassroots activities. I think that means that we get it right, and it's really good to hear the people who are on the ground and do the work. Now, the joint communication, it's joint because basically it's the European External Action Service together with the Commission. So it's not necessarily only on what we call the traditional work of the EU, but also the work that the EU is doing with partners. So this is the novelty. Why we thought we need a new document, because we have started with this subject. I think it's almost 10 years when we have started to reflect a little bit on this, is because the situation is getting worse. It's not getting better. My example is in the Horn of Africa, where you have a prolonged drought, Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, and that fuels food insecurity, forced displacement, and then obviously conflict and tensions within the societies, but also across the borders. Now, this joint communication basically is a set of 30 actions, very concrete actions, which are structured around 4 work strands. First is data and analysis. Second is making it operational, capability development, and partnerships. Now, what that means in concrete terms, I'll give you a few examples. First, we will try to use our satellite center, which is based in Torrejon in Spain, and we will set up a hub, analytical hub, to link a little bit the images and the mostly security related data with the data that we need in terms of climate change, in terms of the degradation of the environment. And this will allow our planners and programmers to take better decisions when it comes to what's needed to be done on the ground. The second example is about a training platform. This is something that we need to work together with the 27 EU member states. You may think that the skills and the knowledge which is needed to tackle the link between climate change, environmental degradation, and peace, security, and defense, you can find it very easily. That's not the case. We have in the room, we have one environmental advisor for one of our missions in Georgia, but you don't find these skills very, very easily. So we need to train more people in member states to make sure that we have the expertise. The third is this network of environmental advisors in all our missions and operations, and here we have two major objectives. Second, to make sure that what we do in terms of crisis management, there is a climate change and environmental degradation angle there in their work, but also to reduce the footprint of our missions and operations. So exactly like what James was saying in terms of the carbon footprint, we are very ambitious, and the hope is that by 2050 we will be neutral in terms of climate neutrality. And then lastly, this is my favorite example. We do a lot of mediation work, either directly but also through NGOs. And what we intend to do is to train the mediators on issues like climate change, environmental degradation, and how that is linked with increased conflicts and insecurity, because this should become part of the normal work that they do in different hotspots all over the world.
Thank you. Audience, so are you still woken? Are you still with us? Then, who has a question? We heard from four very different organizations. Are there any questions to our panelists? Anybody who dares? If not, I continue. Okay, if there are no questions for the moment, yes, was there a question?
Thank you. I couldn't leave you hanging, Chair. Maybe a question specifically to Sagal. I mean, the architecture you're talking about in the Horn sounds encouraging. Are there plans for this to be used in some kind of formula with modifications in the other hotspots in the world? I mean, Africa itself has several hotspots, and the world has many, many more. And maybe if you can emphasize the bit around the pacing, because we tend to have one way in which we look at the pace that needs to be used, and it's struggling. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. I think the example of the Horn should absolutely be picked up by other parts of the world. I think that from there's two sort of angles to that. I think from the perspective of the UN first, in terms of providing, like I say, some of this technical inputs, risk assessment information, etc. I think that is happening currently in lots of different spaces. I do think that different hotspots of the world currently have different levels of comfort, let's say, with the linkage of climate and security. I think somebody on a panel earlier today had talked about some countries don't even want to acknowledge it. And I think that's what makes this region quite unique, in the sense that it's way, all the countries, all the member states are way out ahead in terms of actually accepting that link. The regional organization, IGAD, as you certainly know, in its first iteration was actually the Intergovernmental Authority on Drought and Desertification before it was changed to development. So this is a topic that is sort of front and center. So I think from the UN's perspective, it's something we obviously are going to continue to support to develop in other regions. But this is my point about sort of the technical and the political engagement. And I think talented, high-level political engagement like we have here in the Horn can help. But ultimately, it's going to have to be member states that take that on, and then we provide support, as we're doing here, through technical inputs and also through this upcoming regional peace, climate peace and security hub in terms of supporting in implementing that vision. On the pacing, I mean, I think it's the nature of all change, I think, management, right? Is that you've got a lot of stuff that happens slowly under the surface. And then there's these moments where things move very fast and they're lined up at the right time, and then we can move on it. And I think everyone working here on different policies and certainly on environmental issues can relate to that.
I see another hand. Perfect.
I hesitated because in the morning we were under time constraints. I just want to come back with this question. I'm James Kur from the Republic of South Sudan. I'm an ambassador. Until recently, I was the chair of Khartoum process, handed over to Germany. We are handling these issues of migration. And also not only identifying, but trying to address the root causes of migration, being two, man-made and natural. In our context, in the Republic of South Sudan, as you might be aware, we have one of the largest soot wetlands in the world. And the White Nile River and more than other 30 tributaries, when they burst their banks, that is why we have 7 states out of 10 underwater. But I see this as a blessing in disguise. Flooding is better than the drought. And I always think, thank you, Your Excellency, the President, the way you define security. I think we have taken note of that and we are learning from it. I always think, why is it difficult for us to use this excess water? Because there are areas in the Republic of South Sudan that are affected by drought. Why are we pumping the oil from South Sudan up to Port Sudan, and we cannot pump water to the nearest areas? Why are we investing in the oil while the water today, as we speak, is more expensive than the oil? When you don't need to drill it, it's flowing to the market alone. However, what I want to say is that we need voices so that this soot wetlands is protected. We want it declared as a World Heritage Site so that, you know, the ecosystem that is there and it's biodiverse. It should not be the property of the Republic of South Sudan and South Sudanese. It should be property of humanity, all of us, because it has very good and very big impact environmentally. Again, finally, I just want to say, Africa is so much endowed, and that is the case with the Republic of South Sudan, with natural resources that are enough for everybody. So why can we not shift away from just spoon feeding and serving fish meals? Why not provide fish nets, fish hooks, and teach people to fish themselves? That would be the best way. Let us transform the humanitarian assistance, humanitarian aids into development. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And let's collect the other question as well, please.
Thank you. I'm Hassan Ismail. Probably in a very short way, 4 days ago we had a cross-border engagement with administrators from Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya in Mandera, which is like the triangle. And one of the key issues, we have Dawa River, which is one of the rivers that goes from Ethiopia, Kenya, and then into Somalia. Cycle of floods drought, heavy siltation, because when the rains come and there's a lot of floods. So I could hear from the entire administrators on the ground that they really want to do something, but the massive investment required in some of those engagements is very limiting. The kind of aid and support people have is usually micro, and they are not able to address some of those macro investments that are required. So the question I'm asking is, when can we be able to is it possible for us to think more in macro, especially when you look at the cycle of floods, desert locust, then we have drought, and all these require massive investment. So when is it possible for us to think investing in large scale so that we can be able to, what he said, probably can be able to move towards more of development than a lot of humanitarian assistance. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other wish for a question? If not, then I would give the panel, starting with Sagal, the chance for final remarks. Please answer as much as possible the questions and give us your final words for the day.
Sure, thank you. This is a multilateralism panel. So let me just say, in terms of what we need to continue to do, I think one is strengthening this climate security mechanism and strengthening, working with our partners, UNDP, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations and DPPA. My colleagues are sitting here in the room. And this ultimately increases the capacity of the system to assess these risks and to start to respond. Second, I think, again, as UNEP, our job is to support, ultimately what we all need to do is speed up the adaptation. And in this region, I think specifically peace-positive adaptation. And our role, of course, is feeding in all the important information that needs to happen and supporting the political actors who have to take the decisions they need to take. In the case of South Sudan, for example, I am aware of some adaptation projects that are happening specifically around conservation of some of these wetlands. I think the interesting aspect around adaptation in our region is this issue of making sure that they're peace positive, making sure that the co-benefits of not only the environmental action, but also supporting the peace building in the area. And that's something that we work on quite actively. But to the extent that also it's transboundary, so to the extent that some of these wetlands and some of these resources go outside of the borders of South Sudan into the region, it's really important that this transboundary adaptation cooperation is supported also. And I think that's an important part of multilateralism as we move forward. And then obviously the third thing is just continuing to work together on this problem and continuing to do it in this sort of way where, each party brings their comparative advantage and works together in a complementary fashion because there's not a lot of time.
Thank you very much. Cosmin, if I ask you, what would be your top priority for your organization to work on the multilateral front in the future to address this climate crisis?
Thank you very much. Can I try to answer the two questions?
Please.
Before, and I get back to your question.
You get an extra 30 seconds, although I learned from another meeting today that 30 seconds could be very long.
No, because I think that was an extremely important point, the comparison between oil and water. I'm not sure I would be happier to have to see the water flowing out of the region. I would be happy to see the water more for all the communities in the region. But it's indeed an important point, but I'm pretty sure that in the next decades, the issues around water will be the issues that we're going to discuss. So definitely this will be the case. On the second question, and it's clearly that we have work to do to better coordinate what we do at multilateral level, but also what we do vis-a-vis different actions which are done by NGOs, by local communities. That's very clear. But for me, what is perhaps the most important thing is to make sure that we have the security and the political conditions which would allow for these large-scale investments. Because in the case of Somalia, clearly this is a problem. If you don't have security in one area, obviously people who are responsible for rivers or for wetlands, they know what's needed, but you need to have those conditions in order to upgrade the investments in those regions. Now, the first priority for us is basically to implement what we have said that is needed. So for me, clearly, this is the first priority. But also, it's very important that we link better what we do at EU level with what is done in different hotspots by NGOs, by other organizations. This is a long way to go, and we have a lot of work to do. So this will be my two priorities.
Thank you. James, your top priority in NATO to address climate security risk?
Okay, let me make 2.5 points. One I already mentioned, which is a just peace in Ukraine and keeping the peace in Europe. So that's primordial. Second, from a practical point of view, because we're sort of down in the coal room, I think actually for me, ensuring coherence between what other international bodies are doing, and in particular the European Union and us, in terms of setting standards, in terms of methodologies, in terms of targets, would bring in the 27 members of the EU in some sort of coherence with us, which would include the United States and Canada and the UK and Turkey, and there's a lot of power in this group to be pulling in the same direction. So as staffs, because now I'm taking him to the coal room with me, we can, I think, really work on this over the coming years and have a really concrete effect. And then the third thing I wanted to say was to make a pitch for another structure, which I think will be helpful. And Segal came with colleagues, and I have colleagues in the room too. We are proud to be overseeing the establishment by Canada of the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence in Montreal. There are people here who are part of that. It's just like a teenager now. It's not fully grown, but it'll be fully grown by next year. And it will focus on, practical steps to really make a difference, and it will be really willing to engage with partners. That's one of the roles it's going to play. So I would just commend everybody to, look to when they're fully grown next year and engage with them. And I think that it will bring mutual benefits to NATO, but also to the partners that engage.
Thank you, James. And finally, Carlos, in your current role, what would be your top priority for multilateral engagement to address climate security risks?
Well, I'll point two, which I believe are critical. One is the power of partnerships. And I mention that because I see that functioning. If we go back to the idea of the concept, what it means is the polycrisis is stretching the envelope on the mandate of many institutions. Why? Because you see that your traditional realm of action needs others in order to solve many things. So partnering is key, also in the context of multilateralism. I've seen it in the work we do in the center, partnering with Germany, with Denmark as well, which has been critical with the Pacific Islands. Now the work from the Pacific, the Caribbean, and Africa that the center has done with many others is converging, which is very important and exciting. We've seen it recently also, the interest that has raised in Special Envoy Kerry and even President Biden mentioning the rising nations. So partnering is key. It's the way to address fully. So we need to embrace it, and we need to be open and willing to do it. It's powerful. And the other one, it's hope. I would like to point out hope. I'll give you another example. 1 year ago, I was involved to some extent to something that at the time was called the Bridgetown Initiative in terms of the reform of the financial institutions. Back then, again, not only impossible, crazy. But what about now? Today, we have discussed the necessity over and over to have access to finance to address climate change, human development, SDGs. That's one of the key bottlenecks. It was part of the African Climate Summit. It was within the declaration of the EU-LAC Summit. It was discussed in last General Assembly here in Germany. I've heard some work and excitement around that. And that will be critical to address these challenges. 1 year ago, not going to happen. Now, momentum. There is hope. We need to finish that work there. But imagine unleashing that, the power of those funds for development, for adaptation, for mitigation. And just one thought, how to link that also with security. 1/3 of the countries in the UN system, more than 60, are at a high risk on debt, in terms of debt, either of default or other kind. And I've seen it coming from a developing country. You have to address climate change, human development, the pandemic, infrastructure, paying interest rates, all at the same time. You're going to look for the best option of finance, wherever you can find it. I believe for the health of the system as a whole and security, it's better to give a multilateral answer to that and not let it be a fragmented answer to that. So it's also in the interest, not of human development, not only on climate change, it's also in the interest of security to have a multilateral response to that pressing need of finance, which, by the way, the positive thing is the discussion is moving. There is momentum. So there is hope.
Thank you very much. Perfect final words for the panel. Give a hand of applause to our fantastic panelists.